Um, Welcome, everybody. Our session today is What Does It Mean to Belong? Building Radical Inclusivity Through Play. My name is Meghan Talarowski. I'm the founder and executive director of Studio Ludo. We're a nonprofit whose mission is building better play through research, design, and advocacy, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel. Harrison, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Harrison Pinckney. I am a faculty member at Clemson University, and I primarily work with Black youth. And as I heard someone recently say, my goal is to gird Black youth to get through life with their souls intact.
Cody?
Hi, everyone. I go by Cody QJ Goldberg. I am the co-founder and executive director of Harpers Playground. We are also a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to creating radically inclusive play spaces, and I'm really happy to be here.
Great. That's actually a great transition to talk through the title of today's talk. So what does it mean to belong? Building radical inclusivity to play. And I think we want to start with the big question, which is, why do we build playgrounds? It's a concept that's rooted in the child-saving movement. Developed in the late 1800s, the child-saving movement was focused on children and their futures. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, there was concern about protecting children from poverty and from child labor. Rather than spending time in factories, they wanted children to spend time on playgrounds. While the playgrounds of the early 1900s weren't necessarily safer appearing than factories, children were far better off with fresh air, free time, and proper socialization. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt declared play a right of the child as one of the early presidents of the Playground Association of America. He said, if we would have our citizens contented and law-abiding, we must not sow the seeds of discontent in childhood by denying children their birthright of play. With the rise of children's protections came the idea of the model playground, spaces where children should spend their time and develop a sense of morality, as well as learn how to become good Americans. The early 1900s brought not only industry, but an influx of immigrants from nations across Europe. Bringing with them a variety of cultures, the playground was an ideal way to intercede, to train the children of these immigrant groups on the best way to be an American, democratizing and socializing a diverse melting pot of humanity into one united nation. The playground and its staffed play workers focused on the urban poor, a group that was stereotyped for its delinquency and immorality. They felt that this work done through play would alleviate the perils of poverty for the young and working class, to Americanize the children of immigrants, thus securing a better and more democratic future for their nation. Self-government is to be learned as an experience rather than taught as a theory. Hence, in a permanent democracy, adequate playgrounds for all the children are a necessity. But as time went on, immigration waned and world wars came to pass. New theories about the role of play in childhood emerged. After World War II, the Federal Housing Administration made home ownership for middle-class whites significantly easier, which led to social migrations from urban centers to the suburbs. Play was now seen as the right of the suburban child, with the proliferation of play systems engineered for wide open spaces, supporting the development of the model childhood and the so-called golden era of play. But children in urban areas, particularly children of color, whose parents were restricted from the FHA loan programs, were left out of this investment in play and had to make do with decaying infrastructure and busy streets. But why does that matter? And it's because play is what makes us human. Play keeps us vital and alive. It gives us an enthusiasm for life that is irreplaceable. Without it, life just doesn't taste good. Play is what helps us learn about life. It's what teaches us how to be our best selves. It is a drive as essential as eating, sleeping, and procreating, which means that it is as evolutionarily essential, a compulsion that seems frivolous but actually is what keeps us alive through experimentation, socialization, learning, and joy. It is the essence of humanity, and it is not just for some of us, but for all of us. It is the right of every child. As the early child savers knew, childhood is a precious time of growth and development that must be protected. Play belongs to us all. It's what makes us our best selves. Play builds the kind of free and easy, try it out, do-it-yourself character that our future needs. So with that in mind, I propose that it is time for a new child-saving movement. For too long, we have ignored the needs of children that do not fit into our worldview. Children of color, children of poverty, children that are differently abled, children that did not choose their circumstances but are impacted by our lack of acknowledgement and ignorance. For while many of us have deep and positive memories while at play in well-designed and well-funded play spaces, memories with our children and even grandchildren, for many urban children, this is their play reality. Under-resourced, poorly maintained, if there are even play spaces at all. This is the reality for many urban children. And for children with disabilities, they may actually be stopped at the door, unable to even gain access to their local play space. Which leads me to the questions: which children are worth saving? Who has the right to play? And what does it mean to belong in public play space? I now turn the discussion over to Harrison Pinckney to further delve into the topic.
All right, thank you so much, Megan. Um, so I'm going to give some attention to specifically issues of race, and for the purposes of this talk, use Black youth as our context for understanding how race varies and looks very different for youth of color, families of color. And so I'm going to refer back to a couple of points that Megan mentioned. And one of the first things that I want to point out is her discussion about how our worldview has excluded so many people from having access to playgrounds and play spaces. And so in the academy where I work, one of the things that we are very familiar with is this concept of white normativity. And white normativity is essentially what shapes our worldview here in the United States. And it's this idea that our understanding of what is right, what is normal, what is obviously natural is largely based on the experiences of the white majority. And so, what happens as a result is that it excludes the perspectives of people who are not belonging to that white majority, who may have similar interests, may have similar values and goals in life, but don't have the same set of opportunities. And so, this idea of what is normal, what is standard, as a result, begins to impact the way in which we approach the world and the way in which we are allowed to engage in play. And I really appreciated the quote that Megan presented from Luther Gulick about what is an adequate playground, and this idea that everyone should have access to an adequate playground. So um, just recently, this was just in September of last year, the Trust for Public Land released this report in September of 2020. And what they found in 2018 and 2019 is that parks that serve people of color are half the size, on average, half the size of parks that serve predominantly white communities. They also found that those same parks are 5 times as crowded. And this is all based on issues of race or terms of race. And then when we look specifically at the color green, when we're thinking about finances, and income and issues of poverty, it's a quarter size as large as poor income communities have access to parks that are quarter size as large as those that our high income communities may experience, and they're 4 times as likely to be crowded. So when we think about race, first there is this idea that we are not adequately providing the space for these communities to engage in our play spaces. And secondly, there's a social concept here. And so I talked about white normativity a moment ago, but then there's this idea of the white gaze. And what this specifically refers to is this notion that people of color, especially African Americans, and this even involves children, tend to find themselves under higher surveillance, not just by the police, but also by citizens of communities, even in play spaces. And so there is a history dating all the way back to the 1950s that we have documented, but I'm sure even prior to that, there are stories that are available through oral traditions that highlight how Black youth have been policed in play spaces and how Black families have been policed in play spaces. And we continue to see this even today when we think about stories of Barbecue Becky in Oakland, California, or the young man that was slapped 2 years ago at a pool right here in South Carolina, where I am, down in Somerville, South Carolina, slapped by a white woman for his presence, not for committing any crimes, not for violating any park standard or rules, but simply his presence. And so when we think about who has the right to have access, first we see that structurally, these play spaces are not adequate, that there is not adequate space for these communities. And then in these spaces where youth of color, families of color, Black families are engaged in these play activities and recreational activities, that they are policed at a higher rate. So, what do we do with this information? One of the thoughts that I would present to us is as we think about how do we begin to restructure our parks and our playgrounds, is that we take this approach of the restorative practice philosophy. And what this philosophy drives at is that instead of going into a community trying to fix something on behalf of the community or be the hero or savior of a community, that we come in and we figure out how do we work with communities? How do we work with communities of color in order to reimagine what our play spaces can look like in our playgrounds? And so the ultimate question is, what can we create together? Excuse me. And so I'm going to quickly go through 5 steps for us to consider and to imagine as we connect with communities. And so the very first thing that I would like for us to think about is, are we aware of the traditional owners and influencers that exist within communities of color? If you were to go in and decide that you want to revamp a park or you want to design a new space, do you know who the stakeholders are? Do you know who the gatekeepers are within a community? And if you're not familiar with that, then my first statement is this is where you start. Identifying who are those people that can give you access, who are those people that can lend credibility to your cause. Understanding that for many of our communities throughout the country, especially communities of color, low income communities, there are histories there in which these communities have been taken advantage of, in which these communities have been promised resources or promised access and opportunities. And at the end of the day, when it was time for those promises to be kept, those communities found that those promises were empty. And so, what you will find is in many spaces, gaining access to communities is not the easiest thing, and it requires you finding and building trust with who those stakeholders are, and we'll get to that in a moment. So, the second idea is gathering information, taking the time to really understand the history of a community, understanding what are the relationships that exist within those communities. And so, what you're not doing is going in and just throwing up a playground or putting together a new play space, but really understanding what might be the space that speaks to the community that you're attempting to serve. Thirdly, building trust, building relationships. And this is probably the most time consuming and most tedious part of this entire process, right? So you've identified who your stakeholders are, who your community gatekeepers are, and you've begun to work with them. You start gathering information, learning the history of the community, learning the challenges that that community has faced. That doesn't automatically mean that you now are in a position to begin working. This process of working with communities of color really is one that is built on trust and taking the time to invest not just in that immediate project or that immediate goal that you're working towards, but invest in the relationship that you're attempting to establish, taking the time to let people get to know who you are, let people get to see that you're not just here to reach a specific goal, but you're really here to partner, to work alongside, and to empower the community that you are hoping to serve. A fourth step, and this is after you've taken that time to build a relationship, and if I may, I'll pause for a moment because I see I have a few minutes extra here to talk about that relationship building. I was recently in a meeting with a colleague, and um, we were meeting with a new group, and we spoke with them for about an hour, hour 15, hour and a half or so. And so we get off the call with them, and the colleague says, "So how much time do we invest in this relationship before we decide it's time to, sort of move on, and this relationship isn't necessarily panning out?" And my response to the colleague was, that's not how we approach this work. That we approach this work, that we are here to build a relationship and to get to know this group, and we're here to be of service, and something may come of it or nothing may come of it. But in this process, we don't work with the idea of we're going to have 4 meetings or we're going to have 8 meetings, we're going to be here for 12 months, and then if nothing pans out, we're going to move on. We're going to make ourselves available and let the community know that we're here to serve when you're ready. And when you're ready to move forward, we're a phone call away or we're email away. And that's really the idea behind building trust. And we think of it the same way we think of any other relationship that we build with someone, that we don't, hopefully we don't go in with a concept of what can I get out of this relationship, and it's very transactional, but we go in thinking about how can I really build a meaningful connection with this individual or with this group of individuals or with this community, and hopefully we can build upon that, in the future. And so after you built that relationship, then we move into visioning, and this is where we bring everyone together to think about how do we have, what is our shared vision for what this play space could look like. And one of the things that I think is incredibly important, and I think Cody is going to cover this a little bit in a moment when he talks about inclusive play spaces, is that when we're creating this vision, this isn't a vision for a park that serves a Black community, or this isn't a vision for a park that serves communities of color, or a playground that serves youth of color, but this is a community. What we're hoping is that we're building a vision and we're creating a vision for a space that can be shared by everyone in the community. Where the story that I briefly touched on a moment ago in Somerville, in the process of this young man being slapped by a woman that was at the pool, the statement that she made to him was, "You don't belong here." Right? And so I'm not suggesting that we're working with communities in order to build spaces in which only people of color or African Americans, Blacks, or Latinos feel comfortable, but we build spaces that really speak to the community as a whole. And we bring everyone together to create a vision for this shared space where all of our families, our kids can be able to come together and enjoy the benefits that play has to offer and the benefits that playgrounds have to offer. And so when we go through the visioning, then that helps to, to dictate what the design looks like. And so I love these two examples that are in front of us. So if you look at the first example, you see this brick building with these mosaic designs on the front. This is the Southside Community Center in Ithaca, New York. And Ithaca, New York has uh, a deep, strong community of Blacks that have been living there since the 1800s. And this park actually sits across the street from a church that served as one of the stops for Harriet Tubman when she was taking slaves to freedom in Canada. And so this is a extremely significant space in Ithaca, New York. And right across the street, you look at this church, and And local community members were, when I visited, were telling me about how this particular church, slaves would be hidden in the walls of that church as a part of the Underground Railroad. And so when you look at this particular facility, the design of this facility tells the story and the history of this community. And so, yes, they have images of Harriet Tubman inside this particular facility, but they also have stories of the local Black teachers and community leaders and politicians and preachers and other activists that have served this community over the past 200 years. So when we think about how we're designing these spaces, this particular community is a prime example of an institution that took the time to really bring together the stories of the community and tell those stories in the space that they provide. And to the right of that, you'll see this statue, and this statue is called Rumors of War, and it is actually standing in in the state of Virginia, and this was first unveiled in New York City, down in Times Square, and now it's standing in Virginia, where we know many of our states across the South and other parts of the country have really been in this intense discussion about Confederate statues and what is the appropriateness of them in public spaces. And so in Virginia, one of their immediate responses was to put this black male sitting on this horse. He's wearing a hoodie. He has dreads, and sort of this image of freedom, and freedom of expression and freedom of identity. And they have now put this in one of their public spaces in the state of Virginia, and it really speaks to what this inclusiveness of this space, where this is not a space where we've built it and you just need to find a place to fit in. This is not a space where it's just for Blacks or Latinos, but this is a space for everyone. So as we think about that restorative practice, and we think about, again, visioning, the idea is bringing everyone that their community space is intended to serve together in an effort to think about the design and how do we really communicate effectively who does this space really exist for. And thinking about that, I'm going to turn it over to Cody, and I know he's going to take a different angle on how this space all comes together.
Well, thank you so much, Harrison. I cannot possibly endorse what you just shared about restorative practices more forcefully. And I'm really happy to share that is pretty aligned with what we've been trying to do going on 11 years of Harper's Playground. So the theme for my talk is, does all equal everybody? And I guess you might assume, rightfully so, that I'm going to suggest not always. In fact, Meghan earlier quoted Luther Halsey from the Playground Association. He said all kids, but I'm pretty certain he's not been a champion of inclusive playground design like I would advocate. To bridge the talk from Harrison to myself, I was researching the civil rights movement, and especially was inspired by the Academy Award nominated film Crip Camp. For those of you who've seen it, the woman on the right, Judy, is very familiar. She was a key figure in that film. But Mr. Brad Lomax was not called out properly in the film. And I found an article on Brad in the New York Times. He was not only a founding member of the Black Panther Party in Washington, D.C., but he was the central figure in the longest peaceful occupation of a federal building in San Francisco that demanded the adoption of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, which really became the precursor of the Americans with Disability Act. And it is now going to be a personal mission of mine to see that everyone in the world knows Mr. Brad Lomax in the future. And bridging that or tying together that civil rights movement of the original civil rights movement and Americans with Disabilities Act is really important for me. Imagine if I told you that Al Roker and the good people at Feeding America, every year when they do their food drive, that they hand select 1 out of 5 children that they can tell are the most hungry and deny them food. What would you think if that was the case? Now, of course, it's not what they do, but I want you to imagine if they did. Would that be a surprise? Would it make you angry? Would you think it was immoral? I offer that for your reflection because there's a national nonprofit that suggests play matters for all kids. They have, in 25 years, built over 17,000 playgrounds and counting. And yet, their playgrounds, like this one here, are terribly and woefully underperforming for children with disabilities. I would offer that a child in a wheelchair will get no use from this space. In fact, wood chips are no longer really possibly ADA compliant, though they still get installed. For a wood chip playground like this one to be ADA compliant, it would actually have to be maintained almost on an hourly basis. Once there's a trough kicked into the wood chips, it is no longer ADA compliant. So why does this matter? Much to the point that Meghan's earlier slides were sharing, and I think I'm assuming our audience is kind of already pretty big play advocates, but play is so incredibly important for human development. I never know whether to read the whole quote, but I'm going to go for it. Play is the gateway to vitality. By its nature, it is uniquely and intrinsically rewarding. It generates optimism, seeks out novelty. I love this part. It makes perseverance fun, leads to mastery, gives the immune system a bounce, and I've bolded these parts, fosters empathy and promotes a sense of belonging and community. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the founder of the National Institute for Play, Dr. Stuart Brown, he in fact fell into becoming really one of the world's most renowned authorities on play and its value by studying mass shooters. And his theory early in his work was that it was not necessarily an unhealthy childhood in terms of, say, abuse or neglect that really led to antisocial or even sociopathic behaviors like a mass shooter, but it was literally a lack of good play that would bridge the gap for a person not being able to really cope with their environment and to lead to that kind of unsocial behavior. So obviously play is not only great for giving people really excellent life skills, but it's really important to avoid some very negative outcomes as well. Why do I actually care about all this? What is my story and connection here? This is my daughter, Harper. When she was born, she couldn't breathe, and she was in the hospital and nearly didn't make it on her first day of life. After 1 month in the intensive care unit, we were told that she had a very rare difference called Emmanuel syndrome, and that we should expect she would never walk nor talk in her lifetime. Now here she is on the very first day of taking her very first steps, and as you can see in the background of this image, making her way to our neighborhood playground. This was what would have been the happiest day in our experience with our little sweet daughter, and it soon became a very distressing moment. When we reached the playground, we were welcomed by this little ramp that leads into those wood chips that I've mentioned. And then I really want to highlight this blue railing system. It's called a transfer deck. The ramp and that transfer deck allow a playground like the ones that Kaboom builds to call themselves ADA compliant. Now, the plan here is that a child in a wheelchair or a child like my daughter Harper is intended to drag themselves up onto that ramp and up those stairs. Does that seem like something someone who uses a wheelchair is going to be able to do? It is shocking, and of course, my wife and I decided that we would do something about that, and I'll get into that story in just a minute. First thing that we started to do before we decided to do something about this, we took a look at the sort of existing answer to accessibility. This is very much an accessible playground. You might be familiar with some of these. This is not an inclusive playground. This, to me, looks about as fun as waiting in line at the airport for the security. check out, and there's absolutely no reason to lift an entire play area into the sky like this. It's of no value to lift the whole thing in the air. So this is the playground industry's answer to access, right? This is also devoid of nature. And here in my presentation that I've been giving for years, I usually show a picture of a nature playground that's inaccessible. However, this week, a person who lives near the Sandy Creek Nature Center sent me a long message via Facebook. And I just want to share about this one for y'all, because I think a lot of our listeners may be able to go visit this space. This is a newly opened space, and you can see it's a very lovely nature space for children who have no disabilities. But this mom, Kendra Klein, went there with her daughter's walker. That's oddly enough the exact one that my daughter Harper learned to walk with, and found several areas in which it was not only inaccessible, but it was also unsafe for her child to be there. I would highly advocate the listeners today to make a visit out there with a wheelchair and see what it's like to navigate the space. I'm sure that the folks at the Sandy Creek Nature Center would like all people to be able to experience the joy of outdoor play, but I would challenge that that's not what has happened, and I hope it's not too late. I believe there are changes that can be made, and I really want to inspire a desire to do so. On March 1st of 2011, we assembled a team in Portland, Oregon, to design something that fuses both universal access and natural design. This is, I think, the mandate. If all children are going to get the benefit of play, it has to be universally accessible so they all can access it, and it has to be natural. Children need nature play, especially in urban environments where nature is scarce. We must be using natural materials and giving people the access to the real health benefits of what is nature play. Here's the resulting design that came from that session. And what you can see here is universal accessibility everywhere and lots of natural materials, added plant life, boulders. And now I'll just share a little bit about how we got this built, and then I get to give you a full sense of the design and its values. Harpers Playground, I mentioned earlier, is a 501c3 nonprofit. Using the silhouette of Harper on that maiden voyage journey, we have now built a logo and a design standard, and we're working with communities. I hope, back to what Harrison said, in a restorative practices manner. That is certainly at all rung true for what we're trying to do, and I couldn't agree more. So here's what our playground looked like on opening day, and here's really what it looks like almost all the time. But to give you a sense of the full design, I'm going to dive in and share about some of the elements. So what you can see here, by the way, is much less of what we want people to think about as a playground and much more of a plaza, almost like a community space. And part of the reason that we don't have a lot of Technicolor images, features, and so forth is so that people of all ages and abilities really feel welcome in this space. And now I get to share with you what our design standards are. First and foremost, to be inclusive, the space must be accessible. A person who uses wheels has to get every single place on the site. Then, once they've gotten somewhere, it should be adaptive. Can they use something? That's what makes a space physically inviting. Secondly, by using natural materials and communal design features like circular seating areas and lots of gathering spaces, the space becomes socially inviting. Finally, with really thoughtful details like artwork and musical instruments and really good design lines, the space will become emotionally inviting. For Harpers Playground, this is what we call radically inclusive through 3 levels of inviting design. What matters most to us, of course, is that the people we're designing it for can connect with other people. This is really one of my favorite images that we've gathered since we've opened the first park. Just seeing these 2 kids engaged in conversation. Sometimes play is just conversation. Sometimes it's wordplay. And of course, we think about children, but never forget that sometimes it is the parent who experiences a disability. This woman shared with us that she purchased a home specifically adjacent to our first park so that she could play alongside her child, and that this was the very first time she had ever experienced the joy of pushing her son on a swing. Now, this is what a Harper's Playground design looks like from the as-built drawing, and I really want to just share with you the joy, the majesty, the magic of the Harper's Playground hill. And what I'll first note here is that you can see the spiral and wide pathway so that people who use wheels have complete access to the high point. To the right, there's an adaptive slide, and with the smooth paving all around the hill and within the hill, completely accessible to everyone. But have a look at what kind of play value it offers for people. The children who are doing mountain climbing, the inspiration for a father and son to climb together. Children bring cardboard so they can do cardboard sledding, and I'd like to see people sled down a structure in the wintertime. It's really all weather, and the variety of play value is really incredible. Roughhouse play, like you see on the left here, or just a really contemplative moment for a father and a daughter there. It's really such a great variety of play value. Earlier, Meghan shared a photo of a really large sand area that kind of is heartbreaking to me because it's not accessible. And sand, wet sand especially, being really the holy grail of play materials, is so important to make accessible to all. And that's what we've done at Harper's Playground. And as you can see, it has a really great social play value. Shout out to my daughter, Lennon, doing the puddle jumping there on the left. And as you can see, it really offers a great variety of play as well. I've only witnessed a child be buried one time, but it still looks like a good thing to have happen. And here I am with my two daughters modeling the adaptive swings for all to see. So the model really works for children who use wheels to be absolutely free to roam everywhere, which is really what play requires, freedom to move absolutely everywhere. But what we have found is that an unstructured environment like Harper's Playground, and like most experts will tell you, is better for all children. No structure is what all children need. So there's no trade-off. There's absolutely no downside to making inclusive spaces. In fact, they would not be inclusive if they didn't really work for kids of all abilities. Here are just a handful of the designs we've been able to achieve since we built our first playground. And our vision for the world is everywhere there's Harper's Playground, because we believe everyone absolutely deserves play. And so in summary, we took a place that looked like this and turned it into a place that looks like this. And that's really our vision for the world. Really special shout out today. Those of you in the parks world must be familiar with Jane Jacobs and her work. Just so happens today would have been her 105th birthday, and may the fourth be with her for sure. And this quote from her seminal book, The Death and Life of American Cities: "The more successfully a city mingles everyday diversity of uses and users in its everyday street, the more successfully, casually, and economically its people thereby enliven and support well-located parks that thus give back grace and delight to their neighborhoods instead of vacuity." This to me is everything, because I like to say it's the people that make the party. It's also the people that make the park what it really is. The magic of Harper's Playground is not what's there. The magic is that it does attract the greatest diversity of uses and users, and that's what makes it really, really special. And of course, Jane and the science behind all this is important. I will just share one story that has really motivated my passion well beyond my personal story and my daughter's story. This little girl, Juliana, who lived about an hour's drive from Harper's Playground, also lived only about 5.5 years. She had a very rare disease that left her almost always in a hospital bed, but if she ever left, she had to be in a wheelchair. Before she passed, her mother and a family friend helped her write her story, her life story, in a book. And they knew she wasn't going to live very long. And she dedicated the entire first chapter of her book to the one time she went to Harper's Playground. that one experience of being in a park that made her feel welcome had such a big impact on her. And so I share that story with you as part of why I believe every single playground should be a Harper's Playground, or at least inclusive and natural. Because the main reason Julianne only went one time is because it was a major effort to go, and she should have had one in her neighborhood. She most certainly should. All of this makes me really proud of my daughter, Harper, who loves to swing, really only. In fact, I think she doesn't care much about anything else but a swing, but at least it's in a park where everyone feels welcome. And I believe that all parks should really be sort of wonderlands for everybody. And I really want to thank everyone at Park Pride for inviting me to be here, and Harrison for the wonderful lead in, and Meghan for what you've done. I really look forward to hopefully answering some questions. So that's it for me. Thank you all so much.
Thanks to both of you. Those were amazing presentations. So from both of those presentations, I want to lead into a few questions. We're going to have the Q&A session now. And then for those of you listening in, please feel free to contribute questions. We're going to start with a couple, but we'd love to hear from you as well. So the two things stood out from your presentations for me. For Cody, it seemed like the physical space is what was telling Harper that she didn't belong, and that your goal is to really adapt the physical space and the way that we design so that it's inviting for people of all abilities. And then the thing that really stuck out in Harrison's presentation was literally that woman stating, as she slapped the boy, "You don't belong here." And public play space belongs to everyone. We build it for everyone. So what does it mean? That's the first question. What does it mean to belong in public play space, in particular public play space? And how would you answer that from your experience and your lens? Let's start with Harrison first. I actually can't hear Harrison.
Okay, sorry. There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, yes, thank you. when we talk about the concept of belonging, I think it comes down to seeing a space as yours, seeing a space as this is something that I have ownership, that I have a right to. And I think what we have seen, such as that Somerville example, and we could talk about Central Park last year with Christian Cooper. We can talk about McKinney, Texas in 2018, and the black girl that was body slammed by the police. And we have example after example after example of these reminders that no, this is our space and we're giving you permission to be in it. And since we're giving you permission to be in our space, that means that we can remove you when we're ready, or we can dictate how you act within our space. And what I'm hoping is that we find ourselves moving towards this position where uh, everyone comes in with this equal perspective of ownership, where I belong here. This is my space, and I have just as much right to be free and to express myself as the next user.
Cody, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, well, I fully agree. And I think I appreciate that my presentation was really focused on the actual design, but I really am a firm believer and practitioner of how you get there matters. And one of the ways that the spaces that we've been involved with become more welcoming and that people feel more like they belong is because we do involve the community quite a bit in the process. And when people realize that they actually have the actual power to influence their public park, I think it gives them a lot more sense of ownership of the space and feeling welcoming. And so it's a big part of how we get our projects done is by working with the community. And we need the community not only to actually help us design them, but because we're a 501c3 nonprofit and we're helping pay for them, we actually invite the communities to invest in them. And I think when people actually invest in their parks, they feel like that sense of ownership as well.
I think we have a question from the audience. She says that she's impressed by the emphasis on good design and playgrounds as gathering places. She loves the criteria that you set out. What challenges have you met in proposing them, and how have you overcome them? So I think we'll let Cody answer this one.
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you, Teresa. Our main challenge is convincing adults, and it's really fascinating. We do have adults who believe that our design requires that their children, their typically developing children, are going to lose out on behalf of the minority, right? That small group of kids who use wheels. And it really is amazing when we get a chance to work with children. Children know inherently and actually want to build inclusive environments. Kids are really inclusive, and I think a challenge is just getting some of the adults on board who are worried about that. But by and large, what we have found is that there's a high demand for our model, and a lot of people would like to see these type of playgrounds built.
Harrison, do you have a response? Or actually, oh, okay, here, there's another question. Let's go to the next question. What do you see the role of color with the equipment and features of the playground? Maybe that's another Cody question.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, I'll quickly say that we like the space to look as natural as possible. So the colors we choose usually are going to fit in with the environment. The rubber surfacing that we choose, you'll see playgrounds that have rubber surfacing that's really bright colors for whatever reason, but we choose a color that looks like a natural material. We want the space to feel very calming, basically. So we choose very natural tones for that.
I'm actually going to interject another question, which is we've taken people on tours. I'm from Philadelphia, and we've taken communities of color on tours of playgrounds all across the city of New York. And the ones that they were most inspired by actually were the ones that were the most colorful. And they felt that they were like a reflection of their community. They come from a lot of diverse communities, like places like Jamaica or Africa, and they felt a real resonance with the colors. So actually, I'm going to stay on that color question for a second, because Harrison, when you were showing the mosaics and then the statue, this idea that the way that a space looks is actually resonant of people's backgrounds and the culture that they bring to the space. So while certain communities may like that palette that Cody was talking about, maybe others aren't. So maybe we'll just stay there for a moment.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example that you present. And I think about that comment that I made earlier about information gathering, and I think that's where you begin to sort of understand the significance of certain hues. For example, something that we might randomly overlook, and it's like, oh, we'll just make all of the slides green because green represents eco-friendly something, and we want people to know that the slide is made from recycled materials, as opposed to, again, understanding what might be germane to that particular the community. There are two movies that immediately come to mind: 12 Years a Slave and Black Panther. And don't have time to go into it, but if you were to pay attention to the colors that are being used throughout both of those movies, you'll see some similarities that are popping up. And as an example, the importance of indigo as a color, amongst certain African nations. And there's a very interesting scene if you go back and watch the movie Black Panther, where the Black Panther and his friends, they enter into the casino, and if you look at the colors they're wearing, they're actually reflecting the Pan African flag. And so I think that you bring up a really interesting point about the use of colors and what those colors could mean. But as Cody mentioned, you only get to know that by getting to know the community and asking people for their input, and giving them the opportunity to speak freely on these topics.
This is a great question. How do you reconcile the desire for safety within a play space when communities of color are adamant and fearful of policing? What strategies have been successful without added police presence?
Yeah.
Do
So
you want to answer that one, Harrison?
yeah,
That's a big
this is an
one.
interesting this is a very interesting question, Casey, because I think one of the things that we are um we're challenged with is this idea of a narrative, and who says that these spaces are not safe, right? And I can tell you, growing up, sort of where I grew up in Miami, and I tell friends all the time, if you're a tourist, that's not a good place for you to go. But if you're from that community and you know the families that exist there, and you know the histories of those families, you can hang out at 2 o'clock in the morning and know that you're safe. And I remember very vividly, we had a situation at the playground not too far from my house where one of the kids, or two of the kids in the neighborhood, got into a fight. And instead of attempting to break up the fight, the adult that was on the premises, she just walked down the street and knocked on someone's door. Hey, Mr. Brown, you need to come out here. These boys are fighting. And Mr. Brown came out and broke it up, right? And I think that that's the part of getting to know a community and understanding how communities are structured, and is understanding those gatekeepers. They know who to go to in order to resolve issues. These perceptions of crime and delinquent behavior that are often perpetrated may not necessarily be accurate, right? And so, if we had more time, we could get into the history of policing and how police were initially established. Really, they were slave catchers, right? And then after slaves were freed, they were given a badge, and the connections there. And so I would say that these concerns for safety for people from outside the community may not necessarily be accurate, when you compare them to what people within the community see as issues.
And then I'm going to go kind of a little bit on the flip side of that to Cody's point, where he had that example of the nature playground where the mother felt incredibly unsafe and felt that it was an unsafe space for her child. And I think that there's a common thread between communities of color and communities with children with disability, is that you want the best for your child and you want a space where your child can safely play and grow up to be their best self, right? So I think that understanding the built environment and the policing, it's a little bit hand in hand. What do you think, Cody?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I wanted to add that from all of my research and experience in public park design and learnings, safety is really an outcropping of a strong community. And a park that invites everyone is going to be the safest one possible. For instance, skate parks that tend to have graffiti and issues are the ones that are segregated by themselves, far away from anything else. We've been able to actually put skate parks in some of our parks, and there's no problems whatsoever. It's really when you segregate people or create environments where there's some segregation that issues tend to happen for whatever reason. But really vibrant parks where everybody's there, far safer for everybody. No need for police.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple more questions. Does Harper's Playground include any kind of sensory play for autism? Loose parts to manipulate or people to facilitate play, add extra dimensions to play spaces, and also support inclusion. Any thoughts about elements that aren't fixed into place? That could also invite more people, which builds on your idea of community.
Yeah, I think to some degree, there's only so far design can take you, and then there's a place where sometimes programming comes into play. And we work with a lot of partner organizations that serve a wide variety of communities. We do community play days where we bring in even more loose parts. But by and large, the sensory elements for us are the natural materials, literally the boulders and the plant life, and the wet sand. Those are all sensory and loose parts components. We're certainly looking into finding a way to provide more sticks and branches. I think those have some safety concerns tied to them, but So all of those are being pursued, but it's primarily the natural components that are the sensory play components, really.
From David, communities of color have less access to parks, and those with disabilities in these communities have additional barriers. How do you suggest overcoming these gaps and bringing solutions for everyone? Harrison, do you want to be on deck for that one?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear what Cody thinks about this. I think the challenge that we have, and Cody talked about this in one of his slides about play building empathy for others, and it is, and this is an oversimplification, right? But it is my belief that a lot of what we see occurring right now is really the lack of empathy, right? And it's this idea that um, again, thinking about the white gaze or that white normativity that I mentioned earlier, this idea that you should just be grateful that you have a space, right? It's almost like we have individuals, whether we're talking about communities of color or families that have a member that has a disability. It's this: you should just be happy that we've done this for you, as opposed to really taking the time to say, let me understand what life might look like for you and how we can make life more equitable. And I think that until we are one the honest about the histories of how people of color and persons with disabilities have been treated in this country, and the policies that have been created that have deliberately kept those individuals on the outskirts of looking in. Two, um, uh, thinking about what are the laws that have been needed in order to protect those two groups, and what are the laws that are still needed to move us forward. And then three, really changing the narrative and being honest about the narrative about those first 2 points. We're not going to get anywhere. It'll be great conversations. We'll have small wins here and there. But if we want to see a true systematic change, I think we have to be honest about our history as a country and as a society, and then put policies and laws and money in place that really says that, hey, we're going to do better now.
Cody, do you have anything to add?
I would add, as sort of a still budding play theorist, that I really believe a lot of it has to do with the fact that in America, especially, we have a real play deficit that has been going on for years. And because play helps develop empathy, and because play ultimately helps self-love, a lot of our issues would be, not to come off too Pollyannish here, but if we had more kids getting more better play, a lot of these problems would fix themselves. And to some degree, we have to make sure we start with the next generation. I don't believe anybody who really loves themselves has any time to hate anyone else. I think everybody who hates anyone for any reason is probably needing to look in the mirror. And play is one of the best ways to create self-love. You really can fall in love with yourself through play and see what you're capable of and see how beautiful living is, and I don't think anyone has time to hate anyone else if they really do love themselves. And so I do believe it's in some ways as simple as making sure all kids get real good quality play, and we could kind of fix a lot with that.
I think we have time for one more question. At sites with historical value, do you have guidelines to reconcile play with history?
I guess that's a little bit to me, but I mean, Harrison, unless you want that.
Oh, go for it.
We don't have guidelines per se, and I shared our guidelines earlier. We really believe in having aspirational guidelines and not dictatorial guidelines. I think dictatorial guidelines have helped create the issues we have. ADA guidelines are really insane. So aspirationally, I would say we always take into consideration a location's history. One of our next projects is at the site of a playground that was built by the local fire department on behalf of a young child who tragically had drowned, and her father was the fire chief. So for the first time, we're going to really incorporate a firefighter theme into our playground because there's that history there. And I would suggest that to do well by history, we need, Harper's Playground especially, needs to do better by honoring Native tribes that were the owners of land in the future.
Absolutely. So I think that that's all we have time for. I want to thank you both so much for your time and your contributions. This was a phenomenal presentation. And then I think that we're going to be transitioning into the next speaker. And my apologies, I lost track of the next speaker. But thank you all so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to a break. Thank you all.